Starving child offered her penny. Please save mama. The mountain man's decision made history. They say it happened in the deep snow of Bitterroot Pass. A girl no older than 7, barefoot and trembling, held out a single coin, tarnished, warm from her hand, as her mama lay dying behind her. Folks say the man she offered it to hadn't spoken to another soul in near 10 winters. They say he just stared at the penny, then looked at the girl. What could make a hardened recluse risk everything for a stranger's plea? And how could one small act of mercy echo across generations? This is the tale of a broken man, a desperate child, and the wild decision that turned whispers into legend. When a child's whisper meets a man's silence and mercy rides through the snow, one truth lingers. Some souls are found when all seems lost. Every time I read your comments, I'm reminded how these stories bind us across miles and memories. If you still believe in honor, kindness, and standing up for the vulnerable, then you belong here. Let me know which state you're watching from, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this story with someone who needs it. Snow came down like heaven had opened its sorrow, thick and blinding, swallowing up the world in white. Bitterroot Pass, already cruel in calm weather, turned wicked when the storm rolled in. A small figure moved slow through the drifts, her legs trembling, her breath shallow, cheeks red and raw. 7-year-old Lila pressed forward, dragging one foot after the other through snow nearly up to her knees. She clutched her mother's hand, but it was limp now, heavy and dragging. And the woman's skin was as pale as the ground beneath them. Anna Bell, thin and worn from hunger and flight, let out a soft moan before her knees buckled. She collapsed beside a pine tree, her shawl soaked through, her breath shallow and spaced like they cost something. Lila tried to shake her. "Mama," she whispered, her voice lost in the howl of the wind. "Mama, wake up. We're almost there." But Anna did not stir. Her lips were tinged blue, her eyes closed, lashes dusted with frost. Lila knelt, wrapping her arms around her mother, but the cold bit through her threadbare coat and stung her hands. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a little cloth bundle. Inside, a single coin, a penny, tarnished but still hers. The last thing her mother had managed to save. She looked up the hill. There, half hidden by snow-heavy trees, stood the cabin. Smoke curled from the chimney, thin and gray. It was the only sign of life for miles. Folks in town called it cursed. Said the man who lived there, Silas Judd, hadn't spoken to another living soul in 10 years. They whispered that his eyes were like rifle barrels and that he'd run off hunters with nothing but a glance. Children were told not to speak his name, but Lila wasn't afraid of stories anymore. She was afraid of her mama dying. The snow crunched under her as she stumbled to the porch. Her small fist pounded once on the thick wooden door. Then again, no answer. The wind whipped through her braids. She shivered. Then the door creaked open, not wide, just a crack, and she saw a shadow move inside. He stood in the gloom, tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a coat made of something rough and dark. His beard long and gray. His eyes were the color of steel hammered cold. He didn't speak, just stared at her, like he didn't know if she was real. Lila unwrapped the cloth and held the penny out in her shaking hand. "Please," she said, her lips chapped, voice a thin reed in the wind. "Please save Mama." The man looked down at the coin, then at her. He didn't reach for it. He didn't ask questions. He said nothing at all. Instead, he stepped past her. For a moment, Lila thought maybe he was walking away. Maybe the stories were true. Maybe he didn't care. But then she turned and saw him kneel beside her mother, lift the limp body with arms used to heavier burdens and carry her, silent, steady, into the warmth of the cabin. The door shut behind them with a soft thud, and for the first time in days, Lila felt something like hope. The cabin smelled of pine smoke, old leather, and something bitter steeping in a pot over the fire. Shadows danced across the timber walls, and the warmth, while welcome, didn't chase away the cold entirely. Silas moved like a man built from the mountains, broad-backed, silent, carved from something older than words. He laid Anna gently on a cot near the fire, her breath barely there, her face slack with fever. Lila stood near the door for a moment, snow still clinging to her coat and boots, uncertain if she was meant to follow or leave. Without looking at her, Silas grunted and motioned toward the hearth. She crept forward, sitting on a small woven rug, stretching her hands toward the flames. The heat stung at first, fingers thawing too fast. She bit her lip and blinked fast to keep from crying. Her mama needed her strong. Silas didn't speak. He stirred something thick in a black kettle, then poured it into a chipped mug and added crushed leaves from a bundle hanging above the stove. He knelt beside Anna, tilting her head and coaxing a few sips between her lips. She groaned softly but didn't wake. Lila watched him, noticed how his hands, though calloused and large, moved with strange care. He didn't rush. He didn't flinch. He just worked, steady as snowfall. She dared to glance around the cabin now, eyes tracing the corners. A rocking chair near the fire sat cracked down one leg, the break patched with old twine. Draped over its back was a faded shawl, embroidered, delicate, not the sort of thing a man like Silas would wear. On a shelf by the window stood a small wooden horse, its tail chipped off, and beside it, gathering dust, a pair of child's boots. I'm too small to fit even her. She looked back at him. His face was hidden behind that thick beard and the long hair that touched his collar, but something flickered in his expression. A weight, maybe, or a memory. He caught her staring and raised an eyebrow. She quickly looked down at her hands. "What's her name?" he asked, voice rough like gravel underfoot. "Anna," Lila whispered. "My mama." He nodded once and stood. From a tall cupboard, he pulled down an extra quilt and wrapped it around Anna's legs. Then, after a pause, he retrieved another and handed it to Lila without a word. She clutched it around her shoulders, burying her nose in the worn wool. It smelled like cedar and dust and something sad. He settled into a chair in the far corner, back straight, arms folded, said nothing more. Just stared into the fire like it held secrets only he could read. Lila didn't understand why he had let them in. From the stories, he should have slammed the door and let the storm take them. But something had changed, something unspoken. The cabin was quiet, but not peaceful. It held echoes of lullabies long gone, of footsteps that no longer ran across the floor, of laughter smothered by silence. Lila could feel them, like cold air slipping through the cracks. And though Silas never said it aloud, it was clear. Her presence stirred something buried, something that had been sleeping too long. The wind howled like a beast through the pines, rattling the shutters and moaning against the cabin walls. Inside, the fire gave off a soft golden glow that painted the logs in flickering amber. Anna lay motionless beneath heavy quilts, her skin slick with sweat and her breaths thin as thread. Her fever had climbed steadily over the past 2 days, her body trembling with cold that no amount of fire could chase away. Lila kept vigil at her side, holding her mother's limp hand, whispering soft prayers she didn't know the words to. Silas moved like a shadow in the background, never loud, never rushed, always working. He boiled water, crushed herbs, poured liquids into tiny vials. When he thought no one was listening, he muttered under his breath, words too soft to catch. He didn't ask for help. He didn't offer comfort. But he never stopped tending to Anna. He lifted her when she thrashed in her sleep. He soaked cloths in cool water to press to her forehead. He checked her pulse with calloused fingers that somehow never felt rough. Lila began to watch him not with fear, but with quiet curiosity. He never smiled, but he didn't scowl either. His face, though hard and weathered, held something deeper behind the lines. It wasn't kindness exactly, but it wasn't cruelty. Just a deep, worn sadness. She sensed it the way a child does when they walk into a room where something heavy once happened. On the third night, Lila woke from a nightmare, heart pounding. She dreamed of her father, his boots stomping through the snow, his voice a growl, her mother screaming. She sat up, the room lit only by firelight and the pale silver glow of moon on snow through the window. Anna still slept, lips parted, skin ashen. The chair where Silas usually sat was empty. Lila pulled the quilt tighter around her and crept to the door. She opened it just enough to peek out, the cold biting her cheeks. There. Just beyond the porch, Silas sat on a stump, hunched over something in his hands. Snow drifted down in soft spirals, landing on his shoulders and beard. He was whittling, a piece of wood slowly taking shape beneath his blade. The rhythm was slow, deliberate. She stepped outside, boots crunching lightly in the snow. He didn't turn, didn't speak. Lila sat down in the snow beside him, close enough to feel the warmth of his body through the cold, but not touching. She didn't say anything, neither did he. The forest around them was still, blanketed in white silence. The only sounds were the soft scrape of blade on wood and the distant crackle of the cabin fire. Lila stared at the stars peeking through the clouds, her breath rising like smoke. The nightmare faded, replaced by something quiet and strange. Peace. She didn't know why this man had taken them in, didn't know why he lived alone with old things and no laughter. But for the first time, the stories whispered in town seemed small. She didn't see a monster. She saw a man who hadn't spoken to the world in a long, long time. But tonight, he let her sit beside him. And somehow, that was louder than words. The days passed slowly, like the melt of ice in the shadow of a ridge. Anna's breathing had steadied, her fever broken at last, and the color returned to her cheeks like dawn creeping over the mountains. She still slept long hours, her body weak from the fight, but her hands no longer trembled, and her lips sometimes formed Lila's name in dreams. It was enough to give the girl hope, and hope made her restless. Each morning, wrapped in layers and mittens too large for her hands, Lila stepped outside the cabin while the sun blinked sleepily through the pines. She wandered near the tree line, never too far, drawing with a stick in the fresh snow. Her fingers moved fast, the pictures taking shape before her eyes, mountains with jagged peaks, birds in mid-flight, a woman with soft eyes holding a baby close, and sometimes a man with a long beard standing beside a child. She didn't speak much to Silas, but she knew he saw her, he always did. From the porch or behind the frosted window, he'd watch her as he sipped from his tin cup. He never interrupted her drawings, but he lingered longer each day, gaze heavy with thoughts he didn't share. The snow became her canvas, and though the wind would soon erase it, Lila drew again and again, as if the act of creating could hold the world still for a moment longer. Inside the cabin, the silence between them began to shift. It wasn't warm exactly, but it wasn't cold either. Silas no longer grunted when she passed behind him. He started placing her tea on the table with a slight nod. One morning she found an extra spoon of honey swirled in the cup. She didn't mention it, just smiled into the steam. Later that week, while sweeping the floor with a broom handle twice her size, Lila noticed a smooth wooden shape resting on the edge of the hearth. It was a carved fox, small enough to fit in her palm, its features simple but kind. She turned it over and looked up at Silas, who sat in his usual chair sharpening a blade. He didn't look at her, didn't acknowledge the gift, but she clutched the fox close and whispered, "Thank you," to the space between them. That night, as Silas cleaned his tools, he found something placed carefully on his work table, a piece of paper worn at the corners, the charcoal lines faint but sure. It showed a little girl holding hands with a bearded man, both smiling beneath a tall pine. The child had a braid like Lila's, and the man's coat was the same heavy one he wore every day. He stared at it for a long time, the quiet of the room pressing in. His hand trembled just slightly as he opened the drawer beside him. Inside were old drawings, faded and brittle. A woman smiling in a field of sunflowers. A child on a swing. His hand hovered, then gently placed the new drawing on top, as though it belonged there. The next morning, Lila woke to find a quilt folded at the foot of her bed, its stitching careful and floral, the thread slightly frayed. She traced the patterns with her fingers, knowing somehow it had once belonged to someone else, someone loved. She wrapped herself in it, and for the first time since they'd fled their home, she felt safe enough to hum a tune while brushing her hair. The snow outside kept falling, but inside the cabin something had begun to grow. Not loud, not sudden, just the slow thaw of a man's heart, stirred by the quiet strength of a little girl who chose to draw instead of cry. The fire burned low that evening, casting long shadows against the walls and sending soft pops into the hush of the cabin. Lila sat cross-legged on the rug, her hands busy stitching together a strip of cloth Anna had shown her how to mend. Her mother, propped up with quilts and a steaming mug of broth, watched with tired eyes that held more life than they had in days. Silas was in his chair by the fire, whittling again, the curl of wood shavings gathering at his feet like dry leaves. The mood was still, like the mountain air just before snowfall. Lila glanced at the small boots by the hearth. They had sat untouched for as long as she'd been here, toes pointed inward, dust clinging to the laces. She'd drawn them once in the snow outside, carefully shaping the scuffed toes and worn soles. But now, with the room so quiet and her mama finally awake beside her, she found the courage to ask. "Whose boots are those?" she said softly. The knife in Silas's hand froze mid-cut. His shoulders stiffened, and the motion in the room halted like a string pulled taut. He didn't lift his head, didn't answer, just placed the half-carved shape on the table and stood, walking to the window as if to check the sky, though there was nothing out there but night and stars. Lila felt Anna's hand rest lightly on hers. A silent gesture, enough for now. Later, after the lamps were turned down and Anna slept again, Lila lay wrapped in her gifted quilt, the warmth of it seeping into her skin like memory. The fire crackled lower, then lower still. Silas sat alone in the corner, hat pulled low over his brow, a shadow more than a man. When he finally spoke, his voice was almost a breath. "Eleanor." Just one word. The name passed through the room like smoke, thin, mournful, echoing. Lila heard it but didn't stir. She kept her breathing even, eyes closed, pretending to sleep. Something about the way he said it made her feel she shouldn't speak, that the name wasn't just a memory, it was a wound. When she opened her eyes the next morning, Silas was gone. The chair was empty, the fire cold. A new log sat beside the hearth, freshly chopped, and the fox carving on the mantel had been joined by a small bird. Outside, faint boot tracks led into the woods. Anna was stronger now. She sat upright, the mug in her hand steady, color in her cheeks. When Silas returned, quietly and without announcement, she met his eyes. Her voice rasped like dry wind, but carried weight. "You saved us. I don't reckon many would have." He didn't meet her gaze, just poured water into a tin basin and set it beside her. Wasn't nothing. But when she spoke again, her words caught him like barbed wire. "Lila's father left us up in the hills. Took the money, the horse, and near left her to starve. He was a mean man. Mean through and through." Silas's jaw tightened. His hands stilled over the fire iron. He didn't speak, but the silence swelled, heavy as storm clouds. There was something in his stillness. Not shock, but recognition. Not of the man, but of the cruelty. As if he'd seen it before. As if he'd once been it. The room didn't need more words. His silence said enough. Outside, the wind carried snow off the pines, and the sky threatened another storm. Inside, the quiet grew thicker, but not hollow. Not anymore. Lila watched him from across the room, the boots still by the hearth, the name still hanging in the air. And in that name, something had shifted. Not a healing, not yet, but a beginning. The morning came sharp and gray, the sky the color of ash and iron. Snow blanketed the clearing again, fresh and soft, but Silas's eyes didn't rest on the beauty of it. He stood still at the edge of the porch, arms folded, his breath misting in the cold. His gaze followed a line of broken white near the tree line, boot prints, faint but fresh, slicing through the drift from the north trail. No animal made those. Too straight, too sure. No man from town would take that path. Not in winter. Not unless he was hunting something. Or someone. He moved without sound, retrieving his rifle from the wall like it was part of his body. The wood of it, polished and worn smooth, had seen more years than Lila had drawn breath. Silas didn't say a word as he left the porch and made his way uphill, steps sure and steady despite the snow. His breath came slow, measured. The mountain air was still, but his bones told him otherwise. Something was wrong. From a bluff above the clearing he crouched low, eyes scanning the valley. Then he saw him. A man in a long black coat stood at the far ridge just beneath the shadow of a twisted pine. He didn't move like a traveler. He didn't rest like a lost soul. He stood still, surveying the land below like a crow watching from a fence post. Even at that distance, Silas could feel the weight of his gaze. The man turned, looking toward the cabin, then, just as quick, vanished behind the trees. Silas waited, rifle tucked against his shoulder, but the figure did not return. The woods below held their breath, and even the wind seemed unsure whether to move. When he finally descended the slope, he didn't leave a trail. He walked the creek bed where the water froze thin so no one could follow. Back at the cabin, Lila played in the snow, drawing again, her stick carving swirls into the white canvas. Anna watched from the porch, wrapped in quilts. Her color stronger every day. Neither saw the storm in Silas's eyes as he passed them with only a grunt. He didn't tell them. That night he bolted the door with both latches. Then, as the wind picked up and the pines began to moan, he moved to the windows and checked each shutter, pressing the nails in tighter. Twice. Then a third time. He stacked wood inside the cabin higher than usual, enough to last 3 days without stepping out. He added salt to the stew without saying why. Lila noticed the change. He didn't sit in his chair that night. He stood instead, near the hearth, one hand resting on the rifle propped beside him. His eyes never left the window, though snow had already covered whatever tracks were left. Outside, the wind began to wail. Not loud at first, but long and low, like a warning howled across the ridge. It curled under the eaves and clawed at the chimney. Inside, the fire crackled, but the warmth didn't reach Silas's face. Something had shifted, not just the weather, not just the sky. A presence had come to Bitterroot, and it carried the scent of old danger. Silas didn't need to speak it aloud. He knew it in his bones. Something or someone was coming, and it would not pass through without blood or reckoning. The snow had eased by the third morning since Silas found the boot prints. Outside, the trees stood in silence, their limbs burdened with white. Inside, the cabin breathed with the low rhythm of a fire and the slow returning strength of a woman who'd nearly been lost to fever. Anna sat near the hearth, propped by quilts, her skin no longer ghost pale. Her voice had steadied in the last 2 days, and the brightness in Lila's eyes had returned with it. She hummed now when she played, the tune uncertain but sweet. Silas brewed tea at the stove, his back turned to the room, the scent of pine bark and mint filling the air. Anna watched him, hands folded in her lap, silent at first. She had been waiting for warmth to return to her bones, for the fog in her head to lift, for her tongue to remember how to speak her truth. And now, as the fire crackled low and Lila slept curled in a chair with her fox carving in hand, Anna cleared her throat. I reckon you're wondering what kind of fool woman brings a child into these mountains dead of winter, she said. Silas didn't turn. He poured the steeped tea into a tin cup and handed it to her. She took it with a nod and sipped, eyes never leaving his face. He settled into the chair across from her, his own mug untouched, steam rising between them. My husband, she began, voice quiet but sure. Warren Bell. He wasn't always cruel, least not at first. Had charm when he wanted it, could speak soft enough to turn heads. But there was rot in him from the start. Always drank too deep, spent too fast. Started gambling not long after Lila was born. Said he was chasing a better life for us. Truth was, he was just chasing anything to feel big. She paused, fingers trembling slightly on the cup. Silas didn't speak. He stared into the fire, jaw set. He lost the ranch to a man with a crooked smile and a crooked game, she went on. Didn't even tell me till they came to the door with papers. I begged him to stop. He raised his hand to me the next day. First time it was his hand. Second time it was his belt. Last time he tried to trade me. Said a man in town would clear his debt if I worked for a spell. Said he'd take Lila to his sister's, but I knew better. I took my girl and ran in the night. The words lingered in the room like smoke. Silas sat motionless, but the muscles in his forearm twitched. His knuckles had turned white around the handle of his cup. I didn't know where else to go, Anna added. Just kept walking, heard talk in town of a man up here. Said he wouldn't take kindly to visitors. Figured maybe that was the kind of man who might understand what it means to lose every inch of trust you had. Still, Silas said nothing, but his silence was loud, heavy with things he couldn't or wouldn't name. Anna leaned back, her voice gentler now. You ever know a man like Warren? Silas's eyes didn't leave the fire. When he finally spoke, his voice was gravel low. I was a man like Warren. That was all he said. But the confession struck like thunder beneath quiet skies. Anna didn't flinch, she just nodded as if she'd already known. As if she'd recognized the weight in his silence from the start. In the hush that followed, the fire gave a sudden crack. Embers popped and shifted, casting sparks into the air. Silas stood and added another log, then sat again, shoulders drawn like a man bracing against old wind. Anna took another sip of her tea. Outside, the cold pressed against the cabin, but inside something ancient stirred, not anger, not regret. Something older than both, a flicker in the coals of a soul that hadn't dared feel in years. Anna had spoken her truth. And something in Silas Judd had started to burn. The wind came hard over the ridge, screaming through the pines like a wounded beast. It rattled the shutters and sent snow in ghostly spirals across the clearing. Inside the cabin, the fire burned bright and stubborn, holding back the cold with every crackle and hiss. The warmth clung to the logs, to the wool blankets, to the skin of the three people huddled there. 3 souls pulled together by storm and silence. Silas showed Lila how to chop kindling that morning. He placed her small hands carefully on the hatchet handle, his large ones guiding without pressing, patient in a way that surprised even him. She took to it with a quiet seriousness, tongue between her teeth, jaw set like someone twice her age. When the log finally split and tumbled into the snow, she let out a giggle that startled them both. He looked at her then, really looked, as if the sound was a bell ringing from someplace long buried. She laughed again, brighter now, and it echoed off the trees. Later, they walked the tree line together, Silas showing her how to spot rabbit trails and tie snares from twine and bent willow. She nodded at every instruction, asking few questions, but absorbing it all with the focus of someone who knew what it meant to need a full belly. When one snare caught a rabbit before dusk, she gasped and danced in the snow, lifting it like a trophy. Silas grunted approval, lips tugging almost, but not quite, into a smile. That night they ate together, the stew rich and thick, the meat a gift from the land. Anna sat upright, her strength returning, color in her cheeks and her hair brushed smooth by Lila's hand. For a while there was peace in the cabin. Firelight flickered, laughter whispered, and even Silas's eyes seemed less burdened. Then came the knock. It was soft, deliberate, once, then again. Not frantic like someone lost, not hesitant like someone unsure. Just two hard knocks, spaced like punctuation. Silas was on his feet in an instant, rifle in hand. He moved to the door without a word, jaw clenched. No one came to Bitterroot Pass uninvited. No one came at all. He cracked the door slowly, barrel first. On the step lay a rabbit, its neck twisted, not one of theirs. Beside it, a piece of pine bark, stripped and scraped. Letters had been carved into the flesh of the wood with something jagged. "She's mine." Silas stared at the message, unmoving. Snow bit at his cheeks. Behind him, Lila stepped forward, but Anna's voice stopped her. "Stay back!" When Silas turned, his face was stone. He bent, picked up the bark and the rabbit, and threw them into the fire. The flames hissed, the wood blackening quickly, letters curling away into smoke. Anna stood now, pale beneath the firelight, her breath coming fast. She didn't have to ask. She knew. "It's him," she said, voice barely above a whisper. "Warren." Silas didn't answer. He bolted the door with a heavy hand, then dragged one of the chairs across the floor and wedged it beneath the knob. The sound of it scraping against the wood was harsh and final. Outside, the wind howled louder, as if echoing the knock. Inside, the cabin went still. The storm had broken, not just in the sky, but in the lives of the people huddled together near that fire. Whatever peace they had kindled was no longer safe. Someone was coming, and he didn't knock out of kindness. The sky hung heavy with clouds, bruised and swollen, threatening more snow. Inside the cabin, the fire had burned low, but the room held its warmth. Lila sat at the table, bent over a scrap of paper with a stub of charcoal in her fingers. Her tongue peeked from the corner of her mouth, eyes narrowed in focus as she drew slow, careful lines. Across from her, Silas worked his blade over a block of pine, carving something small and rounded, the shavings piling like sawdust snow between them. The scrape of metal on wood and the scratch of charcoal were the only sounds for a long while. Then she spoke. "Was she your daughter?" Silas's hand paused mid-cut. He didn't look up. "The boots," Lila continued, voice gentle. "By the fire." He set the carving down, took a long breath, the kind that came up from deep places, places where words were buried under years of silence and ash. He leaned back in the chair, hands resting on his knees, eyes locked on the flames. "Her name was Eleanor," he said at last. "Had hair like fire and a laugh you could hear through 3 rooms. She was 10 when the fever came. One night she coughed in her sleep, and by morning she couldn't stand. We tried everything. My wife, Clara, sat with her for days, barely blinking. I thought she might pull through." His voice faltered. She didn't. Lila didn't speak. She just listened. "She died in my arms," he said, eyes still fixed on the fire. "And Clara, she followed not long after, said her heart was too empty to beat." He shook his head, jaw clenched. "I buried them both under the dogwood tree out east, packed up, and rode into these mountains with nothing but the coat on my back and a bottle that never stayed full for long. Thought maybe the cold would take me. Some nights I hoped it would." Silas's voice fell away, leaving the fire to speak in his place, its low crackle like distant thunder. Lila slid down from her chair and walked to the corner where her drawings lay in a folded stack. She sifted through them until she found the one she wanted. Then she returned and held it out. It was the picture of the bearded man and the little girl, hand in hand, standing beneath a tall pine. The girl had a ribbon in her hair. The man wore a long coat and a shadow of sadness in his eyes. Silas looked at it a long time before reaching out and taking it with rough, slow fingers. His thumb brushed the edge. Maybe she sent me, Lila said. He blinked. Once, twice, then nodded. She didn't wait for more, just turned and climbed into her cot, wrapping herself in the old quilt, and let sleep take her. Later, when the fire had dimmed and the cabin breathed only in embers, Silas stepped out into the night. The snow had begun again, soft and slow. He crossed the clearing and opened the door to the old shed, stepping inside with the drawing still clutched in his hand. Out there, beneath the creak of old timber and the weight of years, he let the grief take him. He sat on a crate, the picture resting in his lap, and bowed his head. No one saw him cry. But for the first time in 12 years, Silas Judd wept. The wind carried word faster than any rider could. By the time the sun rose over Elk Hollow, the town's main street buzzed with whispers. A trapper had passed through the northern edge of the timberline and claimed he'd seen smoke curling from the old Judd place. Not just smoke, but a child in the snow, laughing. Said he saw her from the ridge, playing near the woods, with a woman's figure leaning weakly on the porch rail. The townsfolk gathered in clusters, outside the mercantile, in the saloon doorway, under the hitching posts, tongues wagging, theories rising like dust in the wind. Couldn't be, someone muttered. Ain't nobody set foot on that land since Silas Judd put himself up there to rot. Could be squatters, another guessed, or spirits. Lord knows that mountain's seen its share. But two people didn't bother speculating. They just started preparing. Marshal Tom Carden stood at the edge of the sheriff's office, leaning on the frame with a fresh brewed cup in hand. He didn't say much most days, but the name Judd still rang heavy in his bones. Once, years back, he and Silas had worn the same deputy star under the same dusty law, before the fever, before the bottles, before the mountain swallowed Silas whole. Tom tossed the rest of his coffee into the dirt and stepped inside to check his revolver. Across town, Hattie Green was wrapping bundles in muslin, dried lavender, feverfew, strips of bark for coughing, and a jar of honey dark as molasses. Her hands moved with practiced ease, her face lined with age and certainty. Hattie had delivered more than half the babies in Elk Hollow, and her memory was sharp as her sewing needle. She remembered the day Clara Judd gave birth, remembered the soft cry of the infant girl, and the way Silas had held her like something holy. She also remembered the day Clara died, and the silence that followed. By mid-morning, Hattie stood outside her porch with her medicine satchel packed and her horse saddled. Tom Carden rode up quietly, his badge tucked beneath his coat, his rifle strapped behind the saddle. "You think it's true?" Hattie asked as she tightened the cinch strap. "I think there's someone up there who doesn't want to be found," he said. "But trouble has a way of finding its way into quiet places." They rode out before noon, the townsfolk watching them go. No one followed. Most feared the pass, and more feared the man who called it home. The trail was slow and climbed steady, trees growing thicker, air colder. Hattie rode with her shoulders straight, her hands sure. Tom kept his eyes on the snow, noting every broken branch, every scuff in the powder. Signs were there. Movement, fresh, careful, cautious. By late afternoon, they crested a bluff where the trees gave way to a view of the clearing. There it was, the Judd cabin, squat and weather-beaten, chimney coughing steady smoke. A sled sat near the porch, wood stacked high. And in the snow, faint but visible, the shape of a child's drawing, a flower or a sun, half buried by wind. Hattie let out a breath. "That's no squatter." Tom nodded. "That's family." But even as warmth stirred at the sight, he couldn't shake the gnawing unease in his gut. Something was coming. Something dark, low-born, and mean. He'd seen too many tracks leading toward the mountains lately. Boot prints, fresh, heavy. He patted the rifle once and turned his horse toward the cabin. Time to find out what ghosts were living in that house and what devils might be on their heels. The sky was still black when Silas stepped out into the pre-dawn cold, breath hanging thick in the air. He stood on the porch listening. The silence was too perfect. No wind in the trees, no birds, not even the usual groan of the woods settling under the weight of snow. It was the kind of quiet that made the hair on a man's neck rise, the kind that came before something broke. Then, in the east, the night lit orange. A flame surged upward through the trees, licking the sky. It caught fast, fueled by oil and spite. The forest glowed for a breath, then crackled into violence. Silas's eyes narrowed. He didn't need to guess. He knew. Warren Bell had come. Inside, Anna was already on her feet, wrapped in a coat, one hand on Lila's shoulder. She'd seen the glow through the cracks in the shutters. Her face was pale but calm, set with the hardness of someone who'd run out of room to flee. "They're here," she said. Silas nodded once. He didn't explain. He didn't promise safety. He just moved to the back wall, pushed aside a cabinet, and revealed a narrow wooden door half concealed behind firewood. He opened it to a dark, narrow path framed by stone and ice. "The mine tunnel," he said. "It'll take you down past the gulch. Keep to the creek bed after that." Anna looked into the dark, then back at him. "You're not coming." "No. You won't stop him alone." "Not here to stop him," Silas said, voice quiet. "Just here to meet him." Lila rushed forward, grabbing his coat. "You said you wouldn't let him take us." He knelt down, one hand on her shoulder, the other brushing her hair back gently. "And I won't." He placed something in her palm, a small wooden bird, carved with care. She clutched it tight. Anna didn't argue. Her eyes were full, but her will was strong. He helped them down into the tunnel, handed them a lantern, and watched them disappear into the dark. Then he shut the door and rolled the cabinet back over it. He stood for a long moment in the stillness of the cabin, listening to the fire crackle outside, and then reached for his rifle. When he stepped onto the porch again, the sun was just beginning to rise, the light blood red behind smoke and ash. 3 figures emerged from the tree line, walking slow, deliberate. Warren Bell led, thick-shouldered and sneering beneath his hat. 2 hired guns flanked him, rifles slung loose, eyes scanning. Bell saw Silas and spread his arms wide like a preacher before a congregation. "Well, look what the mountain dragged back to life," he called. "Didn't think you'd be fool enough to stand in the open." Silas didn't speak. He stood silent, rifle in hand, his breath calm and slow. Bell took a step closer. "You've got something of mine. A woman. A child. Ain't right. A man hoarding what don't belong to him." Still, Silas said nothing. Bell's voice sharpened. "I'm giving you one chance, Judd. Step aside." Silas didn't move. The wind shifted, carrying the smoke closer. The fire was spreading, creeping toward the cabin's edge like a hungry thing. One of the hired men raised his rifle halfway, and still Silas Judd stood, alone at the threshold of his past, and the line he refused to let be crossed. Not again. Not ever. The mountain held its breath, and then the guns came up. By the time the sun crested the ridge, the smoke was already visible from the far edge of Elk Hollow. It curled like a dark finger into the pale sky, dragging eyes upward, drawing murmurs from porches and shops. Folks paused mid-task, boots half-laced, wagons only half-loaded. The air carried something heavier than fire. It carried the weight of reckoning. Hattie Green rode hard into town, skirts trailing dust and determination. Her face, usually calm with years of gentle wisdom, was carved with urgency. She didn't speak to the gossips gathered near the mercantile. She didn't stop to explain. She went straight to the chapel, where Preacher Klein was sweeping snow from the steps. "They're at Judd's," she said, dismounting before the horse had even settled. Bell brought fire and men. Silas is standing alone. The preacher stared at her, broom forgotten in hand. "And the woman? The girl?" "Gone to ground," she said. "But that man's gonna burn the whole mountain if he has to." Within an hour, the chapel bell rang, not for worship, not for death, it rang for justice. The preacher stood on the steps, Bible in hand, his voice loud over the muttering crowd. "You once called Silas Judd a madman," he said. "A ghost, but that man's drawn a line between good and evil, and he's standing on the side of the Lord today, facing down the devil himself. Tell me, who among us has that kind of courage?" A silence followed, thick and honest. A child's voice broke through, Sarah Mayfield, no older than 9. "Mama says the little girl up there gave the mountain man her penny to save her mama." She looked up at the preacher with eyes wide as truth. "Did he do it?" "He did," Hattie answered, voice steady. "And now he needs us." The townsfolk, once content to whisper and judge, began to shift. A few men mounted their horses. A blacksmith wiped his hands on his apron and fetched his old rifle. A widow passed her boy a bundle of kindling for the fire, then strapped on her husband's revolver. Farmers from the outskirts rode in, drawn by the bell, by the smoke, by the story spreading faster than the flames. A line began to form, not a mob, not a posse, but a gathering of will. People who'd long walked their own trails now turned toward the same path. For the first time in years, the town of Elk Hollow moved as one body. Preacher Klein stood tall as he mounted his mule. "The good book says to love thy neighbor," he called, "even the broken ones, especially them." By midday, they rode in a loose column, horses kicking up snow, hearts thudding with something more than fear. They carried pitchforks and pistols, prayers and firewood, old debts and new resolve. No one spoke much. They didn't need to. The mountain had chosen its side. And so had they. The smoke was thicker now, the fire in the trees behind them casting a hellish glow against the snow, but Silas didn't flinch. He stood like the mountain itself, still, solid, eyes fixed on Warren Bell. The man before him sneered, coat flapping in the wind, the firelight dancing across his twisted grin. "You gonna die for her?" Bell spat, pacing just beyond the porch steps. "That little girl ain't yours?" "Yeah, that woman sure ain't. You don't own nothing but rot and memory." Silas said nothing. He didn't blink. His rifle rested in his hands, not aimed, not raised, but steady, ready. The two men behind Bell, guns slung at their sides, shifted uneasily. They were used to fear, used to men breaking under pressure. But the man before them wasn't afraid. He wasn't sweating. He wasn't shaking. He looked like he'd already faced death and walked away lonely. "Come on, Judd," Bell goaded, stepping closer. "Ain't no law up here. Just me and what's owed. You hand 'em over and I walk away. You keep 'em, and I burn this place down with you inside." Still, Silas did not speak. His silence was louder than any sermon. Then, from the ridge, came the sound of hooves crunching through snow. Dozens of them. Bell turned, brow furrowing. One by one. The townspeople emerged at the tree line, farmers, ranchers, widows, and blacksmiths, all silent, all watching. Hattie rode in at the front, her shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders, her eyes sharp as glass. Beside her, little Lila sat atop a borrowed mare, bundled and brave, clutching the wooden bird in her hands. And leading them all was Marshal Tom Carden, his coat dusted with frost, shotgun slung low across his chest, the star pinned firm to his chest. He dismounted slow, boots crunching in rhythm, and walked forward until he stood just behind Silas. "This here's over, Bell," Tom said, voice even. "You got no claim, no right, and no power left." Bell snarled. "You siding with him? The hermit? The drunk that buried himself up here like a coward?" Tom didn't answer. He just rested a hand on the shotgun's stock and stared. The hired guns glanced at each other. The line of townsfolk hadn't moved, but their eyes spoke plenty. There'd be no easy exit for Bell, no silent backing away. One man even stepped forward and spat into the snow, rifle resting across his shoulder. Hattie dismounted and crossed to Lila, taking her hand in hers. The child didn't speak, but her eyes were wide with knowing. Her mountain man was standing between her and the devil. Again. Belle's face twisted, the mask cracked, rage flared. With a roar, he lunged forward, arm outstretched, hand reaching for the rifle in Silas's grip. He never reached it. The butt of the rifle moved fast and clean, catching Belle square in the jaw with a crack that echoed through the trees like a thunderclap. The man fell backward into the snow, limp and groaning, blood mixing with the white. Silas stepped over him and looked to the ridge, to the town, to Lila. And for the first time, in all the long years he'd been silent, he nodded, not out of habit or politeness, but something deeper. A man once lost had drawn a line, and the town had answered. The snow had settled quiet again, muffling the clearing in a soft hush. Warren Bell was gone, slumped over the back of a horse and flanked by the marshal's men as they led him down the mountain toward a jail cell that would finally hold him accountable. The townsfolk had ridden home slowly, their hearts stirred by what they had seen. A man once ghosted by grief standing unshaken against violence, not for himself but for others, for a child, for a woman, for redemption. Inside the cabin, the fire burned low and steady. Lila lay curled in her cot, the carved fox tucked in her arms, finally sleeping without fear. Anna moved softly through the room, clearing dishes and folding blankets, her steps light with the strange ease of safety. She paused at the hearth and noticed a draft underfoot, a whisper of cold where there should be none. She knelt and ran her fingers along the floor, finding a slight lift in one of the planks. With careful pressure, it creaked upward. Beneath it, wrapped in old cloth, yellowed with time, was a bundle no larger than a loaf of bread. She unfolded it gently. Inside was a letter, ink faded but still legible, the handwriting soft and curved with a woman's grace. At the top, a name, Clara Judd. Anna sat back on her heels, the room suddenly still. She held the letter to her chest for a moment, then stood and crossed to Silas, who sat in his chair staring into the fire, his rifle no longer leaning near, his hands finally empty. "I found this," she said, handing it to him. He took it slowly, eyes falling to the familiar penmanship. For a moment he didn't move, just stared. Then he unfolded the letter, the paper trembling in his grip. His voice, when he read, was raw, low, like gravel catching in a stream bed. "Silas, if you ever read this, it means you finally opened your eyes again. I hope you do. I hope the grief didn't take you whole. You were always more heart than you let on. I saw it in the way you held Eleanor's tiny hand when she was afraid of thunder. I saw it every time you looked at us like we were the whole world. I need you to remember that, love. Even if we're gone, it doesn't mean you have to be. Let someone in again. Let yourself live. Please. Forgive yourself and don't let the mountain bury the man I knew." He stopped reading. The flames flickered, casting soft light on the tears that welled but did not fall. Anna said nothing. She just reached out, placed her hand gently over his, and left it there. Silas looked down at the letter one more time, then folded it with reverence and stood. He crossed the room to the small desk near the window and opened the top drawer. Inside were drawings, Lila's, his own, pieces of memory stitched together by charcoal and sorrow. He placed the letter atop them, closed the drawer, and breathed in deep. Outside, the wind sighed through the pines, but it no longer sounded like mourning. The man who had hidden from the world was no longer hiding. He had stepped forward, not as a myth, not as a recluse, but as Silas Judd, a man still standing. A man who had finally chosen to live. Spring came slow to Bitterroot Pass, like a hesitant visitor knocking on a door long closed. But when it arrived, it did so gently, melting the last stubborn patches of snow, coaxing green from the soil, and carrying the scent of pine and thawed earth through the clearing. The sharp edge of winter softened, and with it, so did the shadows around the old Judd cabin. The land that once stood silent and still now echoed with life. Silas stood beside Anna near the cabin's edge, sleeves rolled, boots caked in mud, a rusted spade in one hand and a seed sack in the other. Together they worked the ground, digging rows into the warming soil. Anna's hands, once trembling from fever, moved steady now, pressing onion bulbs and carrot seeds with care. Silas worked beside her in silence. But it was not the silence of grief. It was the quiet of focus, of purpose. The patch of land they tilled together would become a garden. Not a big one, not yet, but enough to nourish more than just the body. Enough to anchor roots both in the earth and in the heart. Each morning, Lila rose early and sat on the porch steps, sketchbook in her lap, fingers smudged with charcoal. She no longer drew alone. Chickens pecked nearby, the rooster crowed from a stump, and the squirrels had grown bold, darting close as she scribbled stories into the pages. Tales of foxes and brave birds, of mountain giants and girls with quiet courage. Her heroes didn't wear capes. They carried firewood, carved toys, and stood still when the storm came. In town, Hattie Green moved with her usual quiet determination, clearing out the back room of the old feed store, scrubbing windows, and setting up rows of stools. The word spread quickly. A schoolhouse, right there in Elk Hollow, open to any child who could walk or be carried. She called it a place for new beginnings, and no one questioned her. Silas rode in one morning with a cart full of planks and nails. He didn't say much, just nodded and began hammering boards for new benches. Children watched from doorways, eyes wide. Some had only heard stories of the mountain man. Now they saw him up close, sleeves rolled, sweat on his brow, building a place where learning could take root. Back at the cabin, Silas took to carving in the evenings. On a quiet afternoon beneath the budding dogwood tree, he sank a pair of posts into the ground and laid down a hand-shaped bench. Along the backrest, he carved two names, Eleanor in soft curls and beside it a simple sunburst drawing. Lila's. He didn't say what it meant. He didn't have to. Now, when dusk settled over the valley, the cabin no longer crouched beneath the weight of loss. Smoke rose from the chimney in lazy curls, and the windows glowed with lamplight and laughter. The rocking chair creaked again, not from loneliness, but from use. The shawl had been washed, mended, and now warmed Anna's shoulders as she read Lila's latest stories aloud by the fire. The cabin didn't look haunted anymore. It looked lived in. It looked like home. The church bell rang clear across Elk Hollow, its peal sharp and solemn beneath the midday sun. Folks came from the outlying farms and snow-thawed ridgelines, gathering on the dirt road that led to the white clapboard chapel at the town's heart. The doors were propped open, light spilling out across the wooden floorboards and casting long shadows down the aisle. Inside, the pews filled quickly. Men with calloused hands and Sunday shirts, women holding infants quiet against their chests, children sitting upright with wide, uncertain eyes. At the front stood the circuit judge, a lean man with silver hair, stern eyes, and a voice like a hammer on stone. He had come on horseback 2 days prior, riding in with a small escort and a thick ledger bound in cracked leather. The name Warren Bell was already written in it. But today was not just for the sentencing, it was for something deeper, something the whole town had felt rumbling since the fire on the mountain. Warren Bell sat shackled in the front row, his bruises still blooming beneath the collar of his coat, pride stripped from him like bark peeled off a branch. His eyes darted between the faces, faces that had once feared him or turned the other way. Now they stared back, cold and unmoved. The judge raised a hand. "This court is not formal," he said. "But justice does not need a bench to stand on. The people are the ground it walks." He called Annabelle first. She stood, spine straight, eyes steady. She spoke of Warren's cruelty, of the night he traded her safety for a bottle and a lie. She told them of fleeing into the dark with nothing but a child and a coin. She did not tremble, she did not falter, and when she sat down, the room held a long, breathless silence. Then came Lila. Too small for the pulpit, she stood on a crate. Her voice was soft, but it carried. She didn't talk about fear or hurt. She talked about hope, about how her mama needed saving, about a man with a beard who took her penny and didn't speak, but listened with his hands instead. She spoke of drawings and foxes and the warm place by the fire. Her words landed not like arrows, but like seeds. Finally, the judge turned to Silas. He did not move to the front. He stood where he was, near the back of the church, weathered hat in his hands. He didn't speak for himself. Others did. Marshal Carden stood and said, "He was a better lawman these past months than I've been in years." Hattie added, "He didn't just protect them, he changed for them, and that changes us." The judge listened. Then he closed the ledger. "Warren Bell," he said, "for your crimes of assault, kidnapping, attempted arson, and the intent to harm an unarmed family, I sentence you to 20 years of hard labor under federal authority. No pardon, no appeal." A murmur passed through the crowd. Some nodded, a few wept. Justice had come, not rushed, not cruel, but full and sure. The judge looked up once more. "And to Silas Judd," he said, voice steady, "there is no sentence, only thanks." Silas didn't reply. He just tipped his hat slightly, the gesture quiet and full. When the service ended, people didn't scatter as they used to when he passed. They lingered. A rancher clapped him on the shoulder. A woman pressed a folded note into his hand. Children gathered near Lila, asking her to show them her latest story. Hattie stood beside him, her presence firm as ever. Carden, too, arms crossed, eyes watchful. And in that crowded little church, the mountain man became something else, not a ghost, not a legend, a man forgiven, a man returned. The dogwood tree bloomed with quiet grace that spring, its white blossoms opening like soft hands to the sky. Beneath its branches, where the snow had once drifted deep and silent, Silas Judd worked with a steady rhythm. The old floorboards he salvaged from the cabin, each one bearing the weight of years, laughter, sorrow, and silence, were smoothed, sanded, and repurposed. His hammer struck slow and sure, and the scent of cut wood mingled with the sweetness of the petals falling around him. Lila sat cross-legged nearby, sketchbook open in her lap. She watched him work, her charcoal moving in time with the sounds of hammer and bird song. Sometimes she drew the tree, its flowering branches reaching high. Sometimes she drew the bench coming to life, plank by plank, and sometimes she simply drew him, the mountain man who once said nothing and now carved meaning into the world without needing many words at all. When the bench was finished, Silas wiped his hands on his trousers and sat down slowly, as if testing not the wood, but the memory it held. Lila closed her sketchbook and joined him. They sat in silence for a while, the kind that didn't need filling. Then, without turning his head, he spoke. "She would have liked this spot," he said, his voice quiet, rough-edged from disuse but steady. "Eleanor." Lila looked up at him, waiting. "She used to bring me flowers," he continued. "Tiny things she'd find in the woods, violets mostly. Said the mountain was trying to say sorry after a hard winter." His hand reached out, brushing one of the dogwood petals that had landed on the bench. "She was full of stories, just like you. Could see the world in things I never thought twice about." Lila nodded slowly, fingers tracing the lines of the carving he'd etched into the backrest. Two names, Eleanor and Lila, side by side, with a tree drawn between them. Simple, lasting. "She's still here," Lila whispered. Silas looked down at her, eyes softened with something too deep for words. "She sent you, I think," he said finally, "to remind me I wasn't done yet." From the porch, Anna watched them, her smile warm beneath her sun hat. One hand rested gently on her belly, where new life stirred. The garden stretched behind her, green and full, and a line of laundry fluttered in the breeze. Home no longer felt like something distant or fragile. It had grown firm beneath their feet, steady as the mountain that held them. Word had spread in town that Silas had built a bench beneath the dogwood. People began visiting. They brought their children, their stories, their silence. Some came to talk, others just to sit. Hattie brought tea once and left a book tucked beneath the seat. Preacher Klein came and read a passage aloud about redemption and second chances. The bench became more than wood. It became a place where past and future met in the middle, a place where forgiveness was remembered and hope planted its roots. And as the blossoms drifted down each evening like slow-falling snow, Silas Judd would sit beneath that tree beside the girl who'd saved him, telling stories of the one he lost and the family he'd found again. The snow came down soft that winter morning, not with fury, but with the hush of remembrance. Elk Hollow had changed in the years since the fire on the ridge. The town had grown, not in size, but in heart. The schoolhouse bustled with laughter, the chapel rang with more than sorrow, and the old trails were no longer feared but followed. The cabin beneath Bitterroot Pass still stood, its smoke curling steady into the sky, and under the dogwood, bare now, its blossoms sleeping, stood a bench worn smooth by seasons and stories. Lila sat on that bench, her coat wrapped tight around her shoulders, a blanket draped over her lap. Beside her, bundled against the cold in a tiny woolen hat and wide-eyed with wonder, sat her daughter Clara, barely 4, with her mother's eyes and a curious gaze that never seemed to settle. The girl held a carved fox in one mittened hand. The same fox Silas had once carved and left by the hearth so many winters ago. In Lila's other hand rested a coin, weathered and dulled with time. A penny. She turned it slowly between her fingers, the edges warm from her touch. Then, with a smile that carried both weight and lightness, she leaned down and pressed it gently into Clara's small palm. "This," she said, voice tender, "was the only thing I had when I thought the world had forgotten me. 1 penny. I gave it to a man who hadn't spoken to anyone in 10 winters. A man the town called a ghost, a madman, a curse." Clara looked up at her, silent but listening. But he wasn't those things. He was a good man, a quiet man, a man who carried more pain than he ever let anyone see. "And when I gave him this," she said, curling Clara's fingers around the coin, "he made a choice. Yeah, he didn't ask questions, he didn't turn away. He picked up my mama and carried her through the snow like she was his own kin." Clara blinked up at her. "What was his name, Mama?" Lila's eyes drifted to the mountains, where the sun had begun to rise, casting gold across the snowy peaks. "Silas Judd," she said. "A name folks once whispered in fear. Now we say it like a prayer." The girl smiled and tucked the penny into her coat pocket, as though she already understood that some things, some people, carry more worth than anyone can measure in coin. Back in town, they told the story often. The preacher told it as a parable. Hattie told it as truth. Children learned it as part of their letters. S is for Silas, they'd say, the man who stood in the fire. His name was etched into the frame of the schoolhouse door and spoken over the births of children who'd never know the cold kind of fear that once haunted the ridge. And so the story ended as it began, with snow falling quiet on a mountain trail and a single act of mercy passed from hand to hand. 1 penny, 1 name. A decision that made history and a man who became more than legend. He became family.